I am so excited to welcome our first guest, Loren Rosario-Maldonado. She is a leadership development consultant and culture transformation specialist. She's traveled the world as a people strategist, combining HR, leadership coaching, and change management expertise. She's a certified coach, is currently pursuing a PhD on cross-cultural psychology, and like me, and this is the important bit, I think, is one of the first CQ fellows, cultural intelligence fellows of the original set. And that's where we met. And we bonded over our shared passion for cultural intelligence and particularly its link with inclusive leadership. Loren has recently published her latest book, Becoming the Change, The Power of Cultural Intelligence. One of the beautiful quotes from that book is, "In my heart, I carry the rhythms of merengue and bachata," I hope I pronounced that well, traditional Dominican dances, the grit of neurodivergence, the determination and ambition of my Dominican parents, and the privileges and economic advantages of any economic status. And if you're an Emily in Paris lover and one who binge watches it, then you're really going to love this book too. Welcome, Loren. It's so good to be speaking to you today.
It's so good to be speaking with you, my friend. Thank you so much for inviting me on your podcast. And, I love you dearly. We're CQ fellows, no pun intended. And I'm looking forward to having this chat with you. Congratulations on your podcast.
Wonderful. And thank you for agreeing to be our first guest. But let me then talk about you. It must have been a whirlwind since you published your book. In the first place, I think it's the first book to come out of our fellows cohort, so which is great anyway. So we're all really excited about it and well done. But what really struck me as I read through this book was how human it felt. And I felt like you were talking to me. And I love books that are like that, like you're having a personal conversation with the author. And you really focus on just highlighting how, these differences are not meant to divide us, they're meant to unite us. And a better understanding of them is really that path to bringing people together. So what's it been like for you having this book out in the world?
It has been a whirlwind. And initially I was so numb after I published because there were so many things happening last year, our fellowship, this book, PhD, right? Cultura, the business side. So when I published, it was almost like a relief because this story has been sitting in my heart for 5 years.
Yeah.
Writing the book took about close to 2 years, start to finish.
Really?
And in that 2-year process, myself and my voice changed. Not because I didn't want to tell a story, but because I didn't know what that voice looked like. I was in corporate at the time, and we all know when you're in corporate, you're masked somehow. You're cocooned into a specific box. And when, by the time I finished this book, my voice had changed, my identity had evolved. And I wasn't sure what my voice was. And so I had to take time to learn to write real people speak and not academically, which is very, very hard to do, and understand what that voice represented, authentically in a way that I connected with.
Well, congratulations again. And, it's interesting you talk about your voice in this book, which is, I think, incredibly strong. But what I also love about it is the way you bring other people's voices to it. And you write from the perspective, we talk about perspective taking a lot in cultural intelligence, but you write from the perspective of different characters, as well as helping us to see Emily in Paris's, perspective as well in a whole different way. But you also bring these different, you bring Aisha, you bring, different people to into this picture to see the world through their eyes of cultural intelligence and understand how, just changing their perception or understanding more about their own biases and their own prejudices is such a powerful way of beginning to navigate a very complex world around them. And I do love that. And what sort of gave you that idea to sort of, bring those voices into play in the way you did?
Great question. When I first started interviewing people, I was interviewing people from the perspective of an immigrant. I knew, I belonged to a cohort called International Women in Business. And so I was getting perspectives from many, many different people, but the one common denominator was that they were immigrants in the United States, right? Professionals who immigrated to the United States as a result of their work. But I realized that when we're talking about cultural values, it transcends borders.
Yeah.
It transcends geographic locations. It transcends national origin. When we're talking about cultural values, we're talking about values that are shaped by our lived experience. And sometimes that lived experience doesn't go beyond your backyard.
Absolutely.
And so when that aha came, which actually was in the later part of my interviews, what I was most fascinated by the interviews I had done was that people were applying cultural intelligence perspectives without knowing what cultural intelligence was. That's what was so beautiful about it. And that's what really led me to incorporate different aspects of diversity, right? Second generation immigrants like myself, neurodivergent individuals, right? Like Sam. That was my absolute favorite interview because he is neurodivergent. And here he is summoning the courage to go beyond what society expects him to do and think and be, to really position himself in a way that would create connection with a boss who didn't understand how he functioned. So that's what led me to interview these different people with completely different backgrounds. And then combined with Emily, I felt like Emily was me. When Emily started, we were at the peak of COVID. And I remember watching that first episode and thinking, I think I told my husband or my daughter, oh my God, that's me. Emily is me. It was literally, she was depicting on television all the faux pas that I had performed and I had experienced in my life, especially as I started this journey.
Wow. That's so powerful. And it's interesting you talk about cultural values because, as you know, what we do in Above Difference is we do a lot of leadership stuff. And my program is called Leading Inclusively with Cultural Intelligence. So we look at cultural intelligence alongside, value-based leadership and intentional inclusive leadership and change management. Our model brings those four things together. But I have to say that of all the bits I love teaching, and I really do enjoy that, and working with leaders on, the cultural values is that bit, isn't it? Because it's the bit where you literally see the light bulb moments just go ping in the room and suddenly people get it. And I love what you say in your book. And I just want to read out a paragraph from your book. And it says, you quote our mutual friend, Dave Livermore, understanding your cultural values is not about boxing yourself into stereotypes. It's about becoming aware of your inherent preferences, which can sometimes unconsciously influence your behaviors and judgments. This self-awareness is a starting point for developing cultural competence. After all, recognizing our cultural lens allows us to understand that others might view the world through a different set. And I think when it comes to leadership, we say one of our 5 statements is that when leaders lead well, they lead all people well. But if you're going to lead all people well, then you need to lead with cultural intelligence. And so I think there's such a clear link between, for leaders particularly, understanding their cultural value preferences and how it impacts on them and others, and how they lead diverse groups of people. Now, leadership, I know, is something that you've concentrated a lot on in your career. What do you think is that key link, and why should leaders really recognize this as one of the key tools to providing inclusive leadership?
That's a fantastic question. And I learned that the hard way right? Through my own experience. And I want to give you this example. I am Afro-Latino, and I worked for a large conglomerate based in Latin America. And when I began leading people in that space, I was coming at this with a very Anglo perspective, right? I read all the Maxwell books. I absorbed them actually, almost too much sometimes. And I was always reading, right? How to be the great leader by all these, older white traditional males. Okay. And when I came into this space, those that advice or that perspective no longer worked. How did I know this? I wasn't connecting the way I would normally. You can tell someone's giving you the deer in the headlights look, or they are, they are self-managing and their communication with me. I just wasn't sensing a deeper connection. Have conversations and so I realized that my cultural values were showing up in ways that I did not realize in those moments. And cultural intelligence helped me see this, which is why I believe it's so powerful. As I was talking very succinctly, very explicitly, which was coming across very impersonal in my conversation, right? We talk about this in our cultural values. When you are a leader and you're communicating, I was just reading a recent Bloomberg report that shows that communication and interpersonal relationship is the number one skill in demand for leadership and innovation, right? It used to be leadership. It's no longer just leadership skills and strategic thinking. Why? Because we live in a world that is permeated and influenced by technology, and these skills are falling by the wayside. People are communicating through chat now. And so in communicating, I didn't realize that this communication style was not connecting because it wasn't the way they expected me as a leader to communicate. And so until I realized that it wasn't because of indifference that they were not connecting or speaking up with me in these conversations. It wasn't because they were being insubordinate or because they didn't like me or because I wasn't a good leader. It was because they were expecting me to communicate in a different way. And so understanding cultural intelligence and using it helped me realize that it wasn't about my delivery. It was about what they needed from me in order to communicate effectively. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that's a lot of the learning that comes out of the work we do with leaders on our program. And I want to dig deeper on this cultural values, and particularly, because obviously we come at this from different contexts. We're over here in the UK and you've got the States. And even though some of the issues are the same, many are very, very different. And I know one of I suppose the one that really resonates quite a lot especially when I work with diverse leaders, is power distance. And you talk a lot about this in your book. And I think you do exactly what I thought, which is, I think one of the first places I got that message was with my daughter, and recognizing that, wow, I grew up in a high power distance culture and I've raised my in a low power distance culture. And there's a cultural clash happening right in my own room, in my own house. But within the context of the leaders I work with, and we do a lot of work in the health sector, what we call the NHS in the UK, where there are a lot of international nurses coming in from African, sub-Saharan Africa, from Asia, who are a lot of cultures where you're more likely to find high power distance cultural values. And they're coming in to work in, big NHS trusts, often with a lot of leaders who've grown up and lived and worked in this country, who are more likely to be low power, veering towards a low power distance. And you can see where there's a real sort of potential for clashes in terms of stereotypes on either side. And it's interesting you raise that. You address some of the stuff around power distance in your book, but again, coming back to leaders, why do you think that understanding that particular cultural value is so vital to providing an inclusive leadership?
Wow. This one is a biggie for me because it's important to understand how power distance not only influences your leadership ability in dual power distance environments, but it's important for employee motivation,
absolutely,
engagement, performance management, right, communication, and project deliverables. If you hold a certain title, and I, before I go into that, I want to preface that you have subcultures that exist within an organization. You have the individuals, you have the functional areas, culture, and then you have the organizational culture. So here you may have a mix of three, because this is what was happening to me. So I worked in an organization where the power distance level at an organizational level was very, very high. Very high. You know, it's Latin America. And even though the different countries within Latin America have varying degrees of power distance hierarchy, overall, it's still on the high end, right? Coming from the States, it's a much lower power distance. In the organization here, or the satellite, if you will, the power distance was mixed. So we had the head of the organization, the CEO, who had a very low power distance orientation, and functional areas that had varying. So you're having to flex between all these different layers, understanding what your own individual power distance preference is. So I preface this to say, it's important because me coming from a low power distance preference, leading others who come from high power distance areas or preferences, I had to learn to flex my delivery when we were talking about performance management, when we were talking about motivation, how I was engaging that individual in the trajectory of my career there. You know, all of a sudden I realized, because they were expecting more authority, more direction from me, I realized that I had to flex and do that for the sake of engaging them and connecting them. And I had employees who had different levels, right? But the ones that were the tough nuts to crack for me were those that were complete opposite. And so it's important because you need to be cognizant of that it's not because that person is disinterested. It's not because that person is, is not interested in growing or engaging in the project or communicating in a certain way. It is just different.
And also doesn't have initiative, which is one of the things we hear.
And doesn't have initiative, right? They're lazy.
Lazy. They need micromanaging because they need more direction, which some leaders will equate to they need to be micromanaged.
Exactly. And it was not necessarily the case. And that was the moment that became so powerful for me. And actually, I include that story in the book because it's one person, all of a sudden, all barriers went away when I just came from the perspective of curiosity. You know, I didn't assume that she was acting this way because she was high power distance. But all of a sudden, this understanding helped me reframe my approach. And when I reframed, holding judgment and complete curiosity, she then opened up and explained. And so I deduced or deducted that she was high power distance at the time without even applying the assessment, the cultural intelligence assessment. And so coming from that place, then it motivated me to act on it more. And every check-in, my delivery was different, catering a high power distance preference person. So it's important because a lot of times, to your point, we think someone is underperforming for the wrong reason. Now, it's not always the case. Someone may not be adept at their role, right? Someone may not be qualified, and that's okay. But we first have to start with the human side. And that's where cultural values come in.
Yeah. And I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction because I think that's such a helpful sort of segue into this. One of the things that I know we're both passionate about is also some of the very real issues of discrimination and racism and all of those things and how those play out in the workplace. And when we looked at, when we both talked about some of the things around how people from either, high power distance cultures may be perceived or more low power distance preferences may be perceived, there are a lot of assumptions and stereotypes that can come along on either side. What's your personal view about the link sometimes? Do you think there are chances that some of those things can lead to people assuming that actually this leader or this individual, it's about racism, it's about discrimination and prejudice, when actually, and I'm not saying, of course, those things do exist, but to what degree do you think sometimes a lack of cultural understanding of the differences in our values, our approaches, the way we relate to situations and contexts can also lead to perceptions of other things being at play here? And is that something that you find in your work?
Yes, absolutely. There is, like everything, there's a continuum. And I'd like to say that biases are not good or bad. What we do with the biases is what turns toxic. And this is why understanding is so powerful, because sometimes people hold these biases without knowing, number one, but two, without understanding where they came from. And this is why doing the work, like we call it, is important. You have to understand, A, that it is a bias, B, understand the roots behind that bias, and then three, make a choice. Now that you know, when you know, you know. If you don't know, you don't know. But when you know, you have a responsibility to do better because you know. And so this is where that choice comes into play, So there are situations where people who are stereotyping or discriminating in some way are doing so from a place of the unknown, of a lack of understanding. And just because they were shaped to think this way by their lived experience, they think that it is true. They think in absolutes. So dismantling all of that is important, but the person has to choose to do that.
Absolutely. Which is where you've got this really interesting model choice in your book. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what it means for leaders in particular?
Yes, absolutely. I did extensive research on this model. In fact, it's the topic of my dissertation because my experience led to such a awe that I became an even bigger observer of different leaders. And what differentiated the leaders like Dave, like yourself, from those leaders who know but chose not to act on that knowledge, right? And so the model represents all the different components of cultural intelligence, but also components of change management, behavioral theory, and cultural humility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it is very humbling to know that we don't have all the answers. It is very humbling to know and accept that we are not always going to get to a place of competence, of mastery when it comes to this work. We are humans. Humans evolve over time. And so this is a constant reiteration that has to happen. When we say it's a journey, it is a journey, something that you have to come back to each and every day. So the first C is for courage. It's that work. It's that inner work that you have to do before you start anything else. It's that change readiness, right? Looking in the mirror and looking at all the zits, all the freckles, everything that's there, and looking beneath, right? So, but that takes courage. It takes courage to do that.
And that's really important for leaders, though, isn't it? Especially if you're leading, and I say this to leaders, if you're leading a diverse team, and invariably if you're leading a team, it's going to be diverse in some way, shape, or form, seen or unseen difference, then you have to, having the courage to do that work and to be intentional about it is incredibly important, isn't it?
Intention. You said the magic word. You have to do the work and you have to go in first. A lot of times in leadership development, there's not enough focus on the individual.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's always read this book and act on this, but the person hasn't gone inward to figure out what's blurring the lens for you. What's there? How is it showing up in the way that you communicate, that you assign tasks, that you lead meetings, that you manage performance for others who are different? Are you leaning towards people who are similar because you don't know how to deal with the ones who are
different from you? Yeah.
And that leads to biases, So you have to do the work, and that takes tremendous courage. This wasn't an easy road. I had a severe identity crisis when I started this, and it was painful. It was painful. I had to reckon with a lot of things. And had I not done that work, I would not have ever been able to be intentional about what I do and how I show up as a leader, as a mom, as a wife, as a friend. And so that's why courage is the very first step.
And before you move on to the H, I think what I'm really impressed by, Loren, is that, how would you define yourself in terms of your identity? How would you define it? Would you define yourself? I know the terms are different. Would you define yourself as a person of color? Or how would you define yourself?
A fantastic question. Multidimensional.
And the reason I asked this question, just to preface what I was about to say, is that what you're saying is that this applies to all leaders. It's not just about leaders who may be white or multidimensional or people of color or who may define them. This is just about our humanity as leaders, isn't it? And there are a number of words. Absolutely, there are a number of words you've used about privilege and biases and really, looking at yourself in the mirror as a leader. And I think that that's so powerful because this is saying it's everyone, isn't it? We all need to do this. Yes.
Think about this. I'd say multidimensional because the biggest crux to all of this is it doesn't matter what color you are, what shape you are, what your background is, we are more than what you see.
Absolutely.
And for every person, what was powerful for me when I was digging deeper and researching the cultural values, what was the big aha for me, other than, they're shaped by lived experiences, not national origin, was that we all have our identity. And our identity is made up of all these different dimensions. But the priority that each one of us ascribes to all those different dimensions varies person to person. That is the crux of all misunderstanding in diversity. And diversity doesn't mean just racial diversity. It means everything diversity, all kinds, socioeconomic status, education, marital status.
Everything. Yeah. We've got that intentionality, the choice, making a choice to be courageous. And then you've got the H. The H is for humility.
Yes. Cultural humility is understanding that, you don't have the answers. You don't always have the answers. And being humble to accept and respect different opinions. We don't have to, I say a lot, you don't have to adopt to adapt, right? Respect it. And this is why you have to understand what your own triggers are before you can move forward. Because then you can be humble about the fact that people have different triggers in this process. And so it takes this commitment to accept that you don't have all the answers, but committing to learning, committing to improving, self-improving, and committing to disrupting these barriers from this point on. You don't have to be a superhero. You don't have to be, Oprah about it. But you certainly have to do whatever you can in your capacity to dismantle barriers to progress for people of all walks of life.
Absolutely. And I guess that humility, because it's something you mentioned in your book, which I talk about a lot as well, is the importance of becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes.
And I think, and in many, because there's still people who come at a leadership approach from as a leader, I should know it all. And actually, admitting I don't understand or admitting I don't know is showing a kind of vulnerability that isn't expected of leaders. And actually, I always say being a culturally intelligent leader, one of the most important things is understanding how much you don't know. And also being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes.
That gives us a humility that then opens, which, very nicely leads to your next one, which is about openness.
Yeah. You have to be open to new experiences. You have to be, once you humble yourself, you have to be open to the possibilities.
Okay.
When you are a leader, it's very easy to become fixed in your way or the way of doing things. But we have to realize that the world doesn't operate like that anymore. Nothing is static. Nothing is stable. I don't think it ever will be stable. And so you have to be open to the different experiences, different possibilities, sometimes coming from the employees themselves. So be open to perspectives, different perspectives, understanding that it doesn't mean that it has to change who you are at your core. But it means just being open to coexisting with all these different perspectives.
Seeking out those diverse perspectives, really, and seeing that as an opportunity as opposed to a threat, I guess, is
right.
It makes a real difference, doesn't it?
Right.
Okay. And then you've got integration being the next one. Tell us about that, particularly what that means for leaders.
We know that nothing happens if you don't act on it. If you don't act, you're going to stay where you are. You can be open, but if you don't act on what you're learning, in cultural intelligence, we talk about action a lot because you don't become or you don't learn cultural intelligence capabilities if you don't act on the knowledge that you're learning. It stays here. What good does that do for everyone else, particularly as a leader? Right? So you're learning about your cultural values. All of a sudden you realize that you have individualistic tendencies and low power distance leading a high power distance group. Well, what happens when you don't act on your understanding that you are a low power distance leader, right? You will still not be able to engage and motivate. You will not be able to drive performance. in the way that the organization needs to and requires of you as a leader. So you have to integrate the knowledge.
Mm, mm. And I like that because there's you talk a lot in your book around biases as well. And one of the things I say to leaders is keep your biases close, because actually that way you get to see what they're doing. Right? And it's interesting because there's a whole different school of thought that says about, well, let's debias things, let's take the bias out of things, which I find quite interesting because I'm like, no, actually, as human beings, we will always have our biases, and
we're biologically wired for it.
Well, biological, and you said earlier, it's not the biases that are good or bad; it's what we do with them that's important. And I guess that feeds into that point of integration, isn't it? Being aware of your cultural values and preferences is important, but it's just the first step. It's what you do with that and how you integrate that knowledge and awareness into every aspect of your interaction, your leadership, your communication. That's what makes the difference, isn't it?
Absolutely. I remember, I'm a high achiever, exhaustingly so, high achiever. And I remember I've always been an educator and mentor. So I've always, anyone who I've ever managed in my career knows and can attest to sometimes being pesky about it, but about achievement, facilitating achievement, right? Helping people move beyond where they are, whether through education, certifications, or development programs, whatever it was they needed to elevate. And, there were some who were just lackadaisical about it. I didn't, and many times I didn't make it mandatory because I feel like someone should want to learn.
Absolutely.
We're not going to force anyone here, but it does help you with their career. And when I started understanding the different cultural values, understanding how much of an achiever I was, all of a sudden I realized that those individuals may be more cooperative in their approach. And so I would have this discussion in different ways. And this is integrating the knowledge, right? So I understood that even though I am a high achiever, others prefer to achieve differently. This was a big aha for me. So once I understood that, our check-ins were different. All of a sudden, I summoned that curiosity to ask the question, I've been nudging you for a year to get this certification, but I see that it hasn't happened yet. Is there a different certification that you'd like to obtain, or is it the right thing at this time for you? And I can tell you, it gives me chills because the look in their face was relief. I don't have to pretend with this woman anymore. All of a sudden, it became a dialogue about their career. Oh, well, it's not the right time for me, or, I'm thinking of a different track, or I'm not sure right now. And it was okay. They were not performing any less because of it, but the conversation became more engaging and became more motivating for them. Because all of a sudden, here comes diversity and inclusion. They could be themselves. They didn't have to mask around me.
That's really interesting because one of the measurements that we often apply in the public sector to inclusion is looking at the numbers of people who are going on professional programs and on professional leadership programs and advancing their careers. And there are some statistics that will say that people from some groups are less likely to take advantage of those opportunities. And that's seen as a negative thing. But actually, just thinking about it now, I know that many of the groups who are represented in that statistic would come from more cooperative, would be where you're more likely to find cooperative as opposed to competitive cultural values. And so even that sort of understanding could help us change and disrupt the system and some of the stereotypes and judgments that are made about people. But let's get on to your next one, curiosity, because I think you've spoken about this already about, in many ways, that's what you just demonstrated, that curiosity, that willingness to ask and find out. And, a leader I once worked with went back after our program and went around asking people, what's it like to be led by me?
I love that question.
That was what she said. That was, the things she heard back, some were tough to hear, but actually she said it completely transformed, applying that curiosity transformed her leadership. And I also had the pleasure of speaking to someone who she asked the question. And she said, I've never felt more seen by my manager than when she asked me that question. And I think I ended up talking to her for 2 hours about what the department had felt like. So tell us briefly about the curiosity bit.
Being curious for me is that childlike curiosity that you bring to what you do. And as a leader, it's very easy to lose that essence. It's very easy to move away from curiosity because you have all these demands that are infringing upon your ability to be curious. And it seems like a very woo-woo thing to apply to leadership, but it's actually very important. If you don't bring curiosity into your practice, then you're going to remain superficial.
And that's so important, isn't it? And that kind of superficial leadership leads to a whole range of things going wrong, particularly when you've then got the complexities of diversity and different backgrounds and different power balances and a whole number of other things. And in many ways, I think that brings us nicely to the last one, a letter of your model, which is the empathy, because it takes empathy to do all of those things. So I think it's great that it ends on that word. So tell us a little bit about that. And as we wrap up, I suppose I'd like you to just think about 3 things you would like to leave leaders who may be listening to this with in terms of their understanding cultural values, or how they can apply this and become leaders who lead all people well.
Yeah, I would say empathy is, when I was thinking about this model, I was thinking about empathy encompassing the whole thing. Because you first have to have empathy for yourself. This is not an easy process. You have to have empathy for yourself and hold space for yourself. Give yourself the grace to know that it is hard work, but it's work. And you're already doing the work. You're here. You've made a choice. So have empathy knowing that you are doing the work and you will move forward. When it comes to empathy, which is very often confused with compassion, it sounds very simple, but it is not. In order for you to have empathy for others, you have to first have empathy for yourself, and that takes practice. But all of a sudden, when you start applying these, and these 6 components work synergistically, they don't work in silos. They are together for a reason. All of a sudden, when you start integrating and you become curious, you're building empathy without even realizing. Because all of a sudden, you understand. It's not, okay, let me have a checklist. Okay, I checked in. I asked this question. No, it's about being present and holding that space and holding judgment. So as a leader, that's very important. You said it earlier. If you lead this well, you lead well, but you first have to do the work yourself. Empathy happens, I want to say, automatically when you're doing all this work synergistically. It's not a standalone piece that you work on Mondays, and then Tuesdays it's forgotten.
It's got to be right there all the time.
It's got to be right there. And I would say, the top three things that I would want people to walk away with is, number one, we're multidimensional. We're all multidimensional. And that multidimensionality is important. Why? Number two, you have to understand your cultural values, because your cultural values impact everything you do in life. The way you approach your work, the way you lead others, your ability to lead others, your ability to break barriers for others, right? And number three, it takes a choice. Day in, day out, it takes a choice.
Thank you so much, Loren. It's been absolutely wonderful to speak to you. The time has flown by. And thank you for being so generous with your thoughts, the introduction to the book. Now, I know your book's available on Amazon. I think that's the outlet of choice for the UK readers, but I'm assuming that across the world it's available on other outlets as well. Becoming the Change, and I love this book, and I think I'm going to keep reading it. And as you know, it's a book I'm going to be recommending to the leaders that we work with, because I think it just gives such a practical day-to-day understanding of the importance of cultural values, preferences, and that the power of cultural intelligence. So thank you so much, and I hope that leaders will take away those three key points, and definitely the choice model. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.